Pressure profiling is when an espresso machine changes the brew pressure during extraction. Instead of holding 9 bars of pressure from start to finish, the machine might begin at 3 bars, climb to 9 bars during the main extraction, then drop to 6 bars before the shot ends. Changing pressure tends to change flow rate and extraction, shifting what ends up in the cup and when. The mechanics are straightforward. Pressure difference is what drives flow. Flow is what happens when that pressure meets resistance. All else equal, a higher pressure difference across the puck tends to drive higher flow. A lower pressure difference tends to drive lower flow. In practice, the coffee bed's resistance changes throughout extraction as grounds swell and compress, so the relationship between pressure and flow is not fixed. When pressure changes, flow changes. When flow changes, extraction changes. For most of the pump-driven era, machines aimed to deliver a flat 9-bar profile. The pump turned on, pressure hit 9 bars, and it stayed there until the shot finished. That happened because rotary pumps can hold a stable set pressure in normal brewing. Vibratory pumps pulse rapidly, but the system smooths that into a usable brew pressure. Temperature control improved over time, but pressure remained static because the pump technology made static pressure the easiest option. Flat pressure became standard, not because anyone proved it was optimal, but because it was consistent. Cafes pulling high volumes of shots per day needed repeatability more than customization. When every shot receives identical pressure, grind size and dose become the primary variables. That made espresso scalable. Pressure profiling changed the equation by making pressure itself a variable. Spring lever machines had always done this mechanically. The pressure curve they produced was a consequence of how the mechanism worked, not a deliberate flavor choice. Rotary pumps could hold a stable 9 bars through the shot. The consistency was the point. Then manufacturers realized pumps could also be controlled electronically to mimic lever behavior or create entirely new pressure curves. Gradually ramping pressure became possible. Holding low pressure for pre-infusion became possible. Declining pressure at the end became possible. What pressure profiling revealed is that espresso had always been sensitive to pressure variation. Flat 9-bar pressure just masked that sensitivity inside a narrow operating window. The chemistry explains why. Not everything in coffee extracts at the same rate. As a rough heuristic, early extraction skews sharper and more acidic. Push further, and it shifts drier and more bitter. People summarize this as acids early, sweetness mid, bitterness late. Useful as a tasting guide, not a strict compound by compound timeline. Pressure matters here because it changes flow and how the puck behaves, which changes contact time and how evenly water moves through the bed. Higher pressure tends to increase flow rate and extraction speed. Lower pressure slows things down and distributes extraction more gently. At the start of a shot, the coffee bed is dry and fragile. If water hits it at full pressure immediately, flow is more likely to become uneven. Water finds the path of least resistance, usually around the edges or through any weak spots in the puck. Once those channels form, they persist, carrying a disproportionate share of the flow. More of the water starts flowing through those channels, while bypassing much of the rest of the coffee. That creates simultaneous over-extraction in the channels and under-extraction everywhere else. Pre-infusion helps address this by introducing water at low pressure. Lower pressure in the early seconds gives water more chance to saturate the coffee evenly before uneven flow can erode weak spots in the puck. The grounds swell as they absorb water. That swelling increases resistance across the bed. Once the puck is saturated and stable, pressure can climb to 9 bars with significantly reduced channeling risk. During the main extraction phase, pressure and flow together determine extraction efficiency. At a given grind and puck, 9 bars tends to drive higher flow and more aggressive extraction. That typically gives a heavier, more intense result because extraction is happening more aggressively. 6 bars tends to create slower flow and gentler extraction, which can emphasize clarity and delicacy, but may reduce some body. All else equal, lower peak pressure often produces a softer, lighter style of cup, but grind and puck prep can override that. It's a tendency, not a rule. Near the end of the shot, the liquid tends to get drier and more bitter as the puck is depleted and extraction becomes less selective. Maintaining 9 bars all the way through keeps extraction rate high, so the later part of the shot is more likely to pull drier, harsher flavors once the earlier sweetness and brightness have already been pulled in greater proportion. Dropping pressure to 6 or 7 bars at the finish can soften that late-stage extraction while preserving more of what was already working earlier in the shot. The problem is that flat pressure gives you far less control over each phase. You're working with one compromise for all 3. When every shot targets 9 bars from start to finish, deliberate pre-infusion is limited to whatever brief ramp-up or solenoid delay the machine provides. The main extraction happens at one fixed intensity, and the finish extracts everything the pressure can reach. That creates one solution for all 3 phases. It works, but it is blunt. Flat pressure hid the fact that espresso is a multi-phase process with different requirements at each phase. Lever mechanics often happen to align reasonably well with the changing needs of the shot, even though that was not the original goal. Spring levers inherently produce a declining profile. Higher pressure earlier in the shot, tapering toward the end. And that often suits the way espresso changes as extraction progresses. The result was that lever machines often gave a gentler start, stronger pressure through the main body of the shot and less pressure toward the end. When pumps replaced levers, that changing pressure profile was largely replaced by a flatter one. Modern profiling brings it back deliberately. But it also creates confusion, because advice that worked under flat pressure stops applying under variable pressure. Grind size recommendations assume a certain flow rate. If pressure changes, flow changes, and the grind recommendation no longer transfers cleanly. Shot time recommendations assume constant extraction intensity. If pressure varies, a 30-second shot at variable pressure extracts differently than a 30-second shot at a flat 9 bars. This is one reason why espresso guidance often contradicts itself. One person says grind finer and pull longer. Another says grind coarser and pull shorter. Both can be right if they are working under different pressure profiles. But when the pressure context is not specified, the advice sounds arbitrary. Pressure profiling did not create that problem. It exposed it. Flat pressure just limited the conditions enough that most variation stayed hidden. The practical implication is that pressure profiling removes the universal rule. There is no single correct grind size, because grind size interacts with pressure. There is no universal shot time, because time means different things at different pressures. There is no perfect ratio, because yield depends on how aggressively you extract. That does not mean standards are useless. It means standards describe a starting point under defined conditions, not a destination that works everywhere. A 1:2 ratio in 25 to 30 seconds at 9 bars is a reasonable guideline. A 1:2 ratio in 25 to 30 seconds at variable pressure is incomplete information. What profiling does provide is the ability to separate the 3 phases and optimize them independently. Those are not arbitrary preferences. They follow from how pressure affects flow, puck integrity, and contact time, even if the ideal balance still depends on the coffee. Some coffees benefit from aggressive extraction and need sustained high pressure. Others fall apart under that much pressure and need gentler handling. Profiling allows both approaches. Flat pressure allows one. The disagreement about whether profiling improves espresso comes from people optimizing for different priorities without stating what those priorities are. If clarity and separation matter most, lower sustained pressure often wins. However, if body and intensity matter most, then higher sustained pressure usually wins. If the goal is to avoid bitterness, declining pressure at the finish helps. If the goal is maximum extraction efficiency, maintaining pressure through the end helps. The trade-offs are cause and effect. The subjectivity is in deciding which outcome you want, not in how pressure delivers that outcome. Pressure profiling did not fix espresso. Espresso was not broken. Flat pressure was just one way to extract coffee under controlled conditions. Profiling expanded the available conditions. That expansion revealed how sensitive espresso had always been to variables that flat pressure had kept constant. Everything else follows from that. The debates, the contradictory advice, the confusion about whether profiling matters, all of it stems from the fact that espresso is now operating in a wider solution space than it was before. Flat pressure simplified the system by removing degrees of freedom. Profiling restored them. Understanding profiling does not require choosing sides. It requires recognizing that pressure is a tool with mechanical effects, and those effects are predictable once you understand what pressure actually does to coffee. More pressure tends to extract more quickly. Less pressure tends to extract less, more slowly. Variable pressure changes the balance across the shot. That is what pressure profiling is. Not a fix, not an improvement, just a different set of compromises, made on purpose instead of inherited from the pump. Espresso was always this complex. We just didn't have the tools to see it.